A red telephone rings off the hook. Somewhere in the distance, a mushroom cloud blooms in silence. Meanwhile, your toaster is listening. Welcome to the Cold War, an era where the absurd became protocol, secrets were currency, and the line between paranoia and prophecy blurred beyond recognition. This isn't your high school history lesson. These are the questions that keep retired spies up at night. The Cold War didn't just freeze global politics. It left behind a trail of riddles science still can't untangle. Some are covered in dust. Others are classified. All are very real. Lock the doors, unplug your microwave, and prepare to enter the shadows. For the next 2 hours, we're not just telling Cold War stories. We're falling into them. 30 mysteries, no answers, only the unsettling thrill of not knowing. Before we dive in, subscribe. It's free, it's unsettling, and it helps keep these stories alive, even the ones they try to erase. The death of Dag Hammarskjöld. He was the world's most powerful peacekeeper, a poet with a passport. Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, boarded a plane to negotiate peace in the Congo. He didn't arrive. His DC-6 went down near Ndola, northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. Official cause, pilot error, unofficial consensus, something much darker. The flight was supposed to land in a safe zone. The air traffic control logs were mysteriously scrubbed. Eyewitnesses reported a second, smaller aircraft tailing Hammarskjöld's plane. One claimed to see a sudden flash in the air. A sole survivor, Harold Julian, insisted the plane was hit before it crashed. He later died in a hospital under, surprise, suspicious circumstances. He was reportedly recovering well before he suddenly deteriorated. The crash site? Strewn with oddities. Hammarskjöld's body lay unusually far from the wreckage. Was he thrown or moved? Nearby, a playing card, the ace of spades. Make of that what you will. Aboard the flight was a ceasefire proposal meant to end conflict in the mineral-rich Katanga region, a proposal deeply unpopular with European mining interests and Western powers who had stakes, both literal and figurative, in keeping the war profitable. Years later, a former U.S. spy claimed the NSA picked up radio transmissions about intercepting the plane. Swedish investigators uncovered fragments of bullets embedded in trees around the crash site. The UN reopened the investigation twice. In 2017, a UN report concluded there was significant new information indicating the plane was shot down, possibly with the complicity of a state actor, yet no state was named, and no new evidence was brought to trial. The governments of the US, UK, and South Africa were all asked to unseal classified files. They all declined. Why? What could still be so sensitive after 60 years that it can't be released? Unless it was never about what Dag knew, but about what his death signaled, that peace, when inconvenient, gets erased. And if the international community can be this indifferent to the murder of a UN Secretary General, how much easier is it to silence someone nobody knows? Which brings us to the story of how your government might have tried to erase your mind. Project MKUltra's full scope. The mind is a battlefield, and MK Ultra was the Cold War's bloodiest front. Officially, it was a CIA research program on mind control. Unofficially, a psychotropic fever dream where ethics took a backseat to paranoia, acid tests, sensory deprivation, forced hypnosis, electroshock, often without consent. College students, mental patients, prostitutes, prisoners, even other CIA agents. The goal? Create a Manchurian candidate, control a mind like a radio, break a human being so precisely they could be rebuilt. MKUltra wasn't one program. It was 149 sub-projects, sprawling across universities, hospitals, prisons, and safe houses. Some were obvious, others were absurd. One tested whether LSD could make you confess. Another tried to hypnotize people into committing crimes. One attempted to erase memories using a combination of sedatives and electroshock, often leaving subjects permanently damaged. One doctor, Ewan Cameron, conducted something called psychic driving. He'd wipe a person's memory with drugs and electroshock, then play loops of messages for hours. Some patients forgot their names, their families, their lives, and they never consented. In San Francisco and New York, the CIA ran brothels under Project Midnight Climax. They dosed men with LSD, watched behind two-way mirrors, and took notes. About what? Unclear, but someone thought this was the best use of taxpayer money. The kicker? It's likely we only know the tip of the iceberg. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered most of the files destroyed. What we know comes from a single cache of misfiled documents and congressional investigations. But even then, we're told it didn't work, didn't it? Or did it just work too well to ever admit? Victims have come forward and been ignored. Others have vanished. The program's roots extended into the Canadian healthcare system, British military labs, and beyond. There are whispers it never stopped, just went deeper underground. Some claim it was connected to notorious cases. The Zodiac Killer, Sirhan, even Jonestown. That's conspiracy territory. But MK Ultra's real legacy is that it made the unbelievable believable. And if you think that's unsettling, wait until the sea starts pinging back. The ghost submarine incidents in Swedish waters. Sweden is known for its neutrality, minimalism, and meatballs. But during the 1980s, it was also known for something far less quaint: underwater intruders. It started in 1981 when a Soviet whiskey-class submarine, yes, that was the real designation, ran aground near the Karlskrona naval base. It was inside Swedish territorial waters, and it wasn't supposed to be there. The Soviets called it an innocent navigational error. Sweden called it what it looked like: espionage. But that was only the beginning. Throughout the 1980s, sonar blips haunted the Swedish coast. Navy personnel reported strange, metallic sounds, irregular propulsion signatures, and occasionally, clear contact with underwater vessels that vanished before they could be captured or identified. At one point, the Swedish military launched depth charges. They sealed off harbors. They placed hydrophones across the Baltic Sea. Each time they got something: a fleeting echo, a shadow, a mysterious wake. But never a vessel. In 1982 alone, the Swedish Navy tracked at least 40 separate underwater incursions. Yet no one was caught. No submarine was photographed in full. No wreckage surfaced. Theories abounded. Were they Soviet mini-subs, mapping underwater cables? NATO prototypes? Autonomous drones ahead of their time? Or was it mass hysteria, amplified by Cold War paranoia and fish farts that sounded a little too submarine-shaped? Some argued the Soviets were testing the Swedes, probing defenses, rehearsing covert insertions for future invasions. Others said it was the US using false flag tactics to provoke Swedish alignment with NATO. In 1995, the Swedish government admitted that many sonar contacts could not be explained. Some officials claimed the intrusions continued into the 2000s. Then there's the technology. The intrusions were often silent, far too silent for conventional diesel-electric submarines. They moved in ways that contradicted known propulsion systems. One contact moved in reverse without a turn radius. Another disappeared after being cornered in a fjord with only one exit. Did they escape? Or did they vanish? And here's the question that still rattles Swedish defense analysts. If these weren't Russian and they weren't American, then who exactly was swimming beneath their shores? The sea never gave an answer. Just a trail of sonar echoes and long, cold silence. And if the enemy was never seen, what does that say about the wars we never knew we were fighting? The Vela Incident. It was the kind of quiet moment that changed everything. September 22nd, 1979. The world didn't end that day, but it might have gotten very, very close. High above the South Atlantic, an American satellite, Vela 6911, caught something strange. A double flash. Bright, sharp, unmistakable, the signature of a nuclear detonation. Specifically, an atmospheric one. For anyone fluent in Cold War protocol, that flash might as well have been a screaming siren, because nuclear tests above ground, those weren't just illegal, they were invitations to global panic. But here's the part that really sizzled. The region where the flash was detected, just south of the Prince Edward Islands, was nowhere near any declared nuclear powers testing zones. And the US for once wasn't responsible. So what was it? And who pushed the button? Initially, the Carter administration called it an anomaly, something about a meteor and sunlight bouncing off the satellite. You know, those common double flash producing meteors. Privately, they were less dismissive. The National Security Council met, Intelligence reports circulated. Israel's name came up. So did South Africa. The theory, a joint nuclear test between the two nations, carried out in the remotest place imaginable, a patch of ocean so empty even the whales don't send postcards. Why those two? Because Israel never admitted to having nukes, despite, well, everything. And South Africa, at the time, was a pariah state with advanced nuclear infrastructure and very few allies. But it had uranium and secrets. Lots of them. Add in the fact that earlier spy satellites had caught glimpses of suspicious activity on South African naval vessels, plus increased electromagnetic interference, plus a seismic event detected by a Norwegian station nearby, plus classified data we still don't have. Still think it was a weather balloon? A later US panel led by MIT scientist Jack Ruina, the Ruina panel, concluded the flash was probably not a nuclear detonation, but declassified memos revealed that multiple labs, including Los Alamos, were certain it was, like 99.9% certain. But Carter didn't want confirmation. An Israeli nuclear test would have meant confronting an ally. A South African nuclear test, sanctions, political chaos, a diplomatic mess no one wanted on their plate during an election year. So they labeled it a non-event. Case closed. Except it wasn't. Because years later, South Africa admitted to building nuclear bombs, 6 of them, then quietly dismantling them before the end of apartheid. And that 7th one, the one unaccounted for? Yeah, still missing. As for Israel, well, let's just say that nuclear ambiguity is the only policy more sacred than the Sabbath. They've neither confirmed nor denied anything, which in diplomatic terms means they did it, probably, allegedly. Who's asking? Some believe it wasn't even a test. It was a signal, a demonstration, a message to potential enemies that somewhere beneath the global radar, someone had the power to rewrite the map. And then there are the outliers, the ones who think the flash wasn't nuclear at all, but something else entirely. A weapons test using unknown physics, a failed attempt to trigger a pure fusion reaction, or worse, a test involving something recovered, not engineered. One theory, found buried in old naval intelligence documents, suggests a third player was involved. Not the US, not the Soviets, not even Earthbound, depending on how deep you want to spiral. But that's the fun of Cold War mysteries. Sometimes the truth sounds crazier than the lies. What we do know is this: satellites don't hallucinate, and the world doesn't double blink without a reason. To this day, the Vela Incident remains one of the few times a nuclear test may have occurred, without any nation taking credit. A crime without a culprit, a flash with no thunder, a weapon whispered into existence, then swallowed by ocean and silence. And the Cold War's most terrifying message: you don't need a declaration of war to change the world. You just need to press the right button when no one's looking. Which leads us, conveniently, to a device built to press all the wrong buttons, even if no one's left alive to press them. The Dead Hand Soviet Doomsday Device. If nuclear war was ever a game, the Soviets built a machine to make sure no one ever won it. It was called Perimeter, nicknamed Dead Hand by the West. Not a weapon in the traditional sense, more like an automated tombstone for the human race. You've heard of mutually assured destruction, but this was the logical endpoint, a system designed to fire back after the Soviet Union was already dead, like a vengeful ghost with missiles for teeth. Here's the concept. If Soviet leadership was wiped out in a first strike, and if communications from command centers fell eerily silent, Perimeter would activate. No human input required. It would check for signs of nuclear explosions, elevated radiation, disruptions to radio and land-based comms, and seismic activity. If all boxes were checked, a final command rocket would launch, flying over Soviet territory, broadcasting launch codes to surviving ICBMs hidden in silos, trucks, trains, and bunkers across the vast Soviet landscape. It would not target military bases. It would not distinguish between soldier and civilian. It would aim to end civilization. And the scariest part? It worked, at least according to the people who built it. Engineers and former officers have confirmed that the system was built in the early 1980s, during the most paranoid phase of the Cold War, just after the Soviet leadership became convinced that the US might strike first, unprovoked. Think Able Archer, Think Reagan's evil empire rhetoric. Think chess, but with the board wired to explosives. But unlike the Hollywood version, Dead Hand wasn't some glowing red button. It was quiet, cold, almost boring. A chain of protocols embedded in hardened software, monitored by unknown officers deep in underground bunkers, not built to inspire terror, built to outlive it. In interviews years later, some Soviet officers admitted they weren't even told if perimeter was active during their service. It was need to know, and apparently nobody needed to know. But the philosophical terror kicks in here. Is it still on? That's the mystery. After the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no dramatic dismantling of the system, no televised shutdown. The Russian government has never publicly confirmed if Dead Hand was deactivated, dismantled, or just modernized. Think about it. Modern Russia inherited thousands of warheads, deeply buried launch facilities, and a doctrine that still echoes Cold War paranoia. It also inherited a tendency towards secrecy that makes even the CIA look chatty. In 2009, a former colonel involved in Perimeter's development claimed the system had been updated for modern threats. Not dismantled, not unplugged, upgraded. Like turning HAL 9000 into Alexa. Only Alexa has launch codes and a grudge. The real horror here isn't that a robot might end the world. It's that we don't know whether the kill switch is still out there, silent, waiting, watching for the final unspoken command. And the West, we pretended not to notice, because admitting that Russia might have an unkillable system with Apocalypse autopilot would kind of ruin the G8 dinners. So maybe the real question isn't whether the Soviets built a doomsday machine. They did. The question is, what happens when a system built on Cold War paranoia survives long after the war that birthed it has ended? Is it still running? Did someone forget to turn it off? Or, most chilling of all, was that the plan? Because if silence is the new warning siren, then the end won't come with a bang. It'll come with no sound at all. And speaking of vanishing without a trace, that's exactly what Australia's Prime Minister did next. The disappearance of Harold Holt on December 17, 1967, the Prime Minister of Australia went for a swim and never came back. That's not a metaphor. Harold Holt, leader of a Western democracy, protector of the ANZUS alliance, unofficial deputy sheriff to American foreign policy in the Pacific, waded into the surf at Cheviot Beach and dissolved into myth. No body, no footprints, no conclusive explanation. He simply vanished, sucked into the tide, or history, or something else entirely. Officially, it was ruled an accidental drowning. The ocean was choppy. Holt was a strong swimmer, but not invincible. Case closed, sort of. But try applying Occam's razor to Cold War geopolitics. The blade breaks, because Harold Holt wasn't just some beach bum politician. He was one of the staunchest supporters of American involvement in Vietnam. He'd hosted LBJ, declared all the way with LBJ. Let the CIA cozy up on Australian soil. He was knee-deep in the Pacific theater of the Cold War, a man with friends, enemies, and one hell of a classified paper trail. And his sudden disappearance? It smelled fishier than the ocean he disappeared into. Let's talk theories. Some claim it was suicide, depression over political pressure, and health issues, but friends and staff reported no signs. He just bought Christmas presents, scheduled meetings, written speeches. If it was suicide, it was the most composed one in political history. Then came the heart attack theory, or the cramp theory, or the stingray theory, each less convincing than the last. No evidence, no witnesses, no remains. Then it gets weird. One theory, whispered but persistent, claims Holt was removed by the CIA. Why? Depends who you ask. Some say he was too enthusiastic about US cooperation, threatening Australia's delicate balancing act with China. Others say he was about to flip, pull Australia out of Vietnam, expose US operations, compromise alliances. Either way, he became a liability, and liabilities in the Cold War had a habit of vanishing. In 1983, former Soviet spy Victor Marchetti, a CIA veteran himself, stoked the flames by claiming Holt was indeed removed because of national security concerns. No follow-up, no lawsuit, just the eerie silence that tends to follow truth disguised as madness. Then there's the really strange one, that Holt defected, that he was picked up by a Chinese submarine off the coast, spirited away, and spent the rest of his life in a high-rise apartment in Shanghai. Ridiculous? Sure. Until you remember that Cheviot Beach wasn't exactly unsupervised. It was near a military zone, full of defense installations and tracking stations. And that day, no one saw a damn thing. One witness claimed to see dark shapes in the water. Another described strange turbulence offshore. Naval divers searched for weeks and found nothing. Not a wetsuit, not a trace of blood, not a single flipper. The Australian government went full denial mode. No investigation with teeth. No national inquest until 40 years later. It felt more like a cover-up than closure. Then there's the uncomfortable truth of Cold War democracy. Leaders were expendable. If not by foreign hands, then by their own intelligence apparatus. When power is shadowed by secrecy, disappearing someone is a tool, not a crime. Holt's disappearance was so shocking that Australia literally built a memorial swimming pool in his honor, as if to say, yes, our Prime Minister drowned. Here's some chlorinated irony to help you forget. But the Cold War didn't forget, because the Holt case was a reminder that even allies were pawns, that sovereignty was conditional, that being too close to the sun could get you burned or pulled under. And while Holt was never found, his absence left a ripple, one that still hasn't calmed, because when a world leader vanishes without explanation, it opens a new door. Not just to conspiracy, but to plausibility. And once you accept that, the map of what's possible starts to distort. If a prime minister can vanish into the waves and be replaced by a plaque, what else might be hiding just beneath the surface? Speaking of which, let's talk about a 7,600-pound nuclear bomb that's still under the sea. The Tybee Island missing nuke. You've lost your keys before. Maybe your phone, maybe your car, if you've had a particularly bad Monday. But in 1958, the United States lost something a little bigger. A 7,600-pound hydrogen bomb. Not a training dummy, not a simulation. A real nuclear weapon, complete with uranium, tritium, and an explosion capacity of about 3.8 megatons. Roughly 250 times the power of Hiroshima. And as of today, it's still out there, somewhere off the coast of Savannah, Georgia, rusting quietly beneath the sea. This is the story of the Tybee Island nuke, and like all good Cold War mysteries, it begins in the dark and ends with a shrug. The incident happened on February 5th, 1958. A B-47 bomber was on a routine training flight out of Homestead Air Force Base in Florida. On board, one Mark 15 hydrogen bomb. Just a precaution, they said. Mid-flight, the bomber collided with an F-86 fighter jet in midair. The damage was severe. The B-47's pilot, Major Howard Richardson, knew he wouldn't make it to base with the bomb intact. Protocol dictated immediate jettisoning of the payload. Safety first. So he dropped it into the waters near Tybee Island. Here's where things should get comforting. You'd expect divers, ships, helicopters, Geiger counters, a full-scale search, followed by a recovery, followed by a relieved press release. But that's not what happened. The Air Force searched for a bit. Then they gave up. They declared the bomb irretrievably lost. Just like that. They also declared it non-nuclear, a practice dummy with no plutonium core. Except years later, documents emerged suggesting otherwise. In 1966, a Department of Defense memo admitted that the bomb did contain a plutonium pit. Not only that, it included enriched uranium and possibly tritium, making it capable of producing a full-scale nuclear explosion. Suddenly, this wasn't a misplaced screw. It was a ticking time bomb, lying somewhere in shallow salt water, about 16 miles from a major city. Local fishermen have reported strange readings on sonar. Divers have picked up radiation spikes. Some theorize the bomb has already started leaking contaminants into the surrounding ecosystem. Slowly, invisibly. The military's response? Nothing to see here. They insist the bomb poses no threat, that it's stable, that it's buried under several feet of sediment. They even suggest that trying to recover it now would be more dangerous than leaving it in place. Kind of like if your neighbor dropped a bear trap in your living room and said, just don't touch it. Ever. In 2004, a retired Air Force colonel named Derek Duke mounted a private search. He claimed to have pinpointed the location using radiation detectors. What he found was ambiguous. Elevated radiation, yes. but not enough to confirm a warhead. The government declined to investigate further. The question then becomes, why the cover-up? Was the bomb more dangerous than admitted? Did it contain classified components? Or was it part of a broader pattern of Cold War accidents the US wanted buried? Literally and figuratively, because Tybee wasn't an isolated case, there were at least 32 broken arrow incidents, lost, misplaced, or accidentally deployed nuclear weapons during the Cold War. Several are still missing, and each time the explanation is the same. Trust us. But trust, like radioactive material, has a half-life. The idea that a nuclear bomb could be dropped a few miles from a tourist beach, written off as misplaced, and then ignored for decades, that's not incompetence, that's confidence. Confidence that the public will forget, that no one will dig too deep, that the sea will keep secrets better than people do. And so the Tybee Island nuke sits, or doesn't, leaking or not, real or a myth, a Schrodinger's bomb, both harmless and catastrophic, depending on who's asking. But here's the Cold War twist. Maybe it was never about the bomb itself. Maybe the true weapon was the message it sent, that even the most powerful nation on Earth could lose control of its deadliest tools and then shrug it off. And if a government can misplace a nuke, what else might it be covering up? Say, for example, 9 hikers fleeing something in the frozen Russian wilderness, their bodies twisted in ways no avalanche could explain. The mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident. It started with a hike. It ended with a funeral. Times 9. In February 1959, 9 Soviet students, experienced mountaineers led by Igor Dyatlov, set off into the Ural Mountains. Their destination, Mount Otorten. Translated from the local Mansi language, it means, "Don't go there," always a promising start. They never came back. Weeks later, a search party found their abandoned tent. It had been slashed open from the inside, as if something had terrified them enough to flee barefoot into sub-zero temperatures in the middle of the night. Then they found the bodies. Some were frozen in poses of panic, half-dressed, limbs curled against the snow. Others were found months later, buried beneath 10 feet of snow, missing eyes, tongues, and in one case, half a face. One hiker had a chest injury equivalent to a car crash. Another had a crushed skull. None of them had external wounds consistent with those kinds of traumas. The tent still held food, warm clothing, equipment. Whatever happened, it wasn't just sudden. It was horrifying. The Soviet government launched an investigation. Then, just as quickly, they shut it down. Official cause? A compelling natural force. That's not an explanation. That's a placeholder for something they didn't want to, or couldn't, name. And the theories poured in. Some say it was an avalanche. But the tent wasn't buried. The slope wasn't steep enough. And the hikers wouldn't have calmly cut their way out. Fled downslope, then died in scattered patterns if a wall of snow had collapsed on them. They weren't rookies. Others blamed the Mansi people, local reindeer herders, for attacking the group, but the autopsies showed no signs of hand-to-hand violence, no stab wounds, no defensive injuries, and no motive. Then things got weirder. Radioactive traces were found on the clothing of some victims, higher than background levels, though not Chernobyl-level intense. Still, in a Soviet case file, that's the kind of anomaly that whispers rather than shouts. Scientists who analyzed the scene decades later called it inconclusive, but the presence of any radiation raised eyebrows. A few witnesses in nearby villages reported seeing orange orbs in the sky on the same night the hikers died. Glowing, silent, hovering. Military tests, natural phenomena, something else entirely. Fast forward to the 1990s. With the Soviet Union gone, former officials and military personnel began to speak. Carefully, some hinted that there were weapons tests in the area. Others suggested the hikers had accidentally stumbled upon something classified, parachute mines, experimental sonic weapons, or even the Cold War's favorite boogeyman, chemical agents. One researcher proposed a wind vortex theory. Katabatic winds so violent they cause panic, disorientation, and even hallucinations. But that doesn't explain crushed ribs and missing eyes. Another popular idea? Infrasound. The wind howling over the mountain may have created a low-frequency hum. Inaudible, but physically disturbing. In theory, it could cause anxiety, paranoia, even irrational behavior. Maybe it spooked them into fleeing. Maybe it wasn't just the cold that killed them, but here's where the Cold War fog rolls in. Some believe the Soviet military knew exactly what happened, that the hikers saw something they weren't supposed to see. Missile debris, biological agents, or even the testing of MKULTRA-style mind control techniques on Russian soil. No, it doesn't make sense, but neither does the scene they left behind. Photos taken by the hikers themselves, recovered from undeveloped film, show them laughing, cooking, building snow shelters, and then in the final frame, a blurry figure, tall, vaguely human, shadowed against the trees. Naturally, this has fed theories about Yetis, aliens, interdimensional rifts, anything except Occam's razor. But in the Cold War, even Occam needed clearance. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the case. Their new conclusion? Avalanche. Again. Case closed. Again. Except this time, researchers across the world pushed back harder. The evidence still didn't line up. The terrain didn't fit, the injuries didn't match, and the timing, conveniently coinciding with the Russian government's renewed push to control historical narratives, was suspect at best. So what really happened on Dyatlov Pass? Something terrifying enough to send 9 trained mountaineers sprinting into minus 30 degrees Celsius night. Something powerful enough to crush bone without breaking skin. Something strange enough for the Soviet Union to bury it under decades of half-truths and silence. And if the mystery feels bigger than the mountain it occurred on, it's because it touches something deeper. The idea that even in remote corners of the world, Cold War secrets were always watching. And sometimes they struck first. 9 dead in the snow. No closure. Just a legacy of fear stitched into the ice. And speaking of legacies, the next mystery is about one American whose disappearance didn't just raise eyebrows. It quietly implicated half a dictatorship. And if that's how silence works at the top, imagine what slips through at the bottom. Subscribe before the next name gets erased. The death of Boris Weisfeiler. Boris Weisfeiler left the United States in late 1984 for what was supposed to be a quiet hiking trip in Chile, a chance to clear his head, breathe some mountain air, maybe take a few photos. He was a math professor, brilliant, quiet, absent-minded in the classic sense. Numbers were his world. Equations didn't kill people. But that's not how the Cold War worked. Even math could get you murdered. Weisfeiler was last seen near the Los Sauces River in the foothills of the Andes. He was alone, traveling light. No signs of trouble. Then, gone, vanished like so many others in that era, without even the dignity of a confirmed death. The official explanation was that he drowned while trying to cross a river, that he slipped, hit his head, and was pulled downstream by the current. End of story. Except it wasn't. Years later, a declassified Chilean police report contradicted that account completely. It claimed Weisfeiler had been arrested by Chilean security forces, that he was interrogated, that he may have been transferred to a secret compound run by a religious cult with strong ties to the Pinochet regime, Colonia Dignidad. Now we're in Cold War deep water. Colonia Dignidad was founded by a German immigrant named Paul Schaefer, a former Nazi medic turned cult leader. Under the guise of a Christian commune, Schaefer built a private fiefdom in rural Chile. Surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, attack dogs, and landmines, the colony was equal parts Jonestown, Abu Ghraib, and Cold War black site. Inside, systematic abuse, torture chambers, underground bunkers, medical experiments, and, according to multiple investigations, a revolving door for both Chilean intelligence operatives and possibly foreign agencies. The CIA knew about Colonia Dignidad. The West German government knew too, but during the Cold War, allies were judged less by their ethics than by their usefulness. And Chile under Pinochet was useful, especially if you were trying to keep communism out of South America or disappear someone inconvenient. So, when a US citizen, a Jewish academic with ties to Soviet emigres, goes missing near one of the most secretive compounds in the hemisphere, and the official version is he probably drowned, you start to wonder. Weisfeiler's sister Olga spent decades trying to piece together the truth. She filed FOIA requests, met with US diplomats, pressured Chilean officials. What she found was damning. Declassified US documents show that within months of Boris's disappearance, American officials suspected foul play. One memo referenced involvement of Chilean security services. Another mentioned difficulties in pressing further due to political sensitivities. Translation, we know they did it, but we're not going to push too hard. Why? Because Colonia Dignidad wasn't just a cult. It was a Cold War utility belt. Schaefer's compound had a functioning airstrip, advanced radio equipment, surveillance gear, and underground facilities. There are credible reports it was used to detain and interrogate dissidents, and possibly to store weapons. In the 1990s, after Chile's return to democracy, survivors and former members testified that people had been killed there, tortured, disappeared. No one could prove Boris was one of them. But in 2000, the Chilean government reopened the case, citing new evidence suggesting he had not drowned. The investigation dragged on for years, caught between red tape, silence, and the uncooperative ghosts of Cold War alliances. As recently as 2012, the Chilean Supreme Court acknowledged that Weisfeiler was likely abducted and killed, but no one has been prosecuted. His body has never been found, and the US government, still cautious, still quiet, still using phrases like insufficient evidence, because here's the heart of the mystery. Was Boris just an unlucky tourist in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was he flagged, perhaps wrongly, as a spy, a defector, a threat? Was his backpacking trip misinterpreted by paranoid Chilean authorities, or was he knowingly targeted by a regime afraid of intellectuals, Jews, foreigners, or simply anyone they didn't control? The Cold War didn't need a reason. It just needed a justification, and in the eyes of secret police and shadow governments, silence is always easier to manage than apology. Today, the Colonia Dignidad compound is a tourist attraction. You can walk the same paths, eat in the same mess hall, even sleep in the old guest houses. There are pamphlets, guided tours, a gift shop, but the ghosts, they don't need souvenirs. They're already part of the story. And if one missing math professor can vanish into a dictatorship while the world looks the other way, what about the plots that almost happened? Operation Northwoods. In 1962, the US military drafted a plan to commit acts of terrorism on American soil and blame it on Cuba. You read that right. The proposal was called Operation Northwoods, and it wasn't a fringe fantasy or a rogue agent's daydream. It came straight from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military brass in the country. The plan made it all the way to the Secretary of Defense. Here was the pitch: fake hijackings, stage bombings, sink a U.S. ship, kill civilians if necessary, then blame Fidel Castro, and finally, use the outrage to justify a full-scale invasion of Cuba. In a different timeline, the Cuban Missile Crisis would have started in Miami, not Havana. Let's rewind. In the early 1960s, the CIA was fresh off the embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs. Castro had survived. Worse, he'd thrived, aligning tighter with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, anti-Castro exiles were pressuring Washington to do something, anything, to finish the job. So the Pentagon, in full Cold War paranoia mode, said, what if we lit the match ourselves? The Northwoods document, declassified decades later, reads like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, only it's real. Here's just a sample of what it proposed. Stage a mock attack on Guantanamo Bay using friendly Cuban agents dressed as saboteurs. Set fires, destroy ammunition, maybe even shoot US soldiers. Make it look real. Hijack a civilian airliner, replace it mid-flight with a drone, and detonate it remotely. Blame Cuban operatives. Bonus points if American students are on board. Launch a campaign of terror in American cities. Bombs in public places, false arrests, planted evidence, all designed to frame Cuba. All this just to create a justifiable reason to invade. And here's the darkest twist. The plan wasn't rejected because it was morally insane. It was rejected because President Kennedy said no. That's it. A single no between reality and nightmare. The Joint Chiefs, including future Vietnam architect General Lyman Lemnitzer, approved the plan unanimously. They handed it to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. He brought it to JFK. Kennedy, already skeptical of the military's appetite for escalation, killed it on sight. Then a few months later, he was dead. Now, was Northwoods connected to the assassination? Let's not go full tinfoil, not yet. But it does tell us something chilling. The distance between democracy and deception was thinner than advertised. And for every no the president said, there were 5 more plans waiting in drawers. The public didn't learn about Northwoods until the late 1990s, when it was released among a flood of declassified documents related to JFK's assassination. At first, people thought it had to be fake, but it wasn't. It was just too real to believe. And remember, this was not a rogue CIA operation. This was mainstream Pentagon strategy, presented in formal language, signed by generals, rubber-stamped and paper-clipped. All it lacked was timing. Think about it. If Kennedy hadn't said no, if there had been just one convenient excuse, one crisis, one small provocation, Cuba might have been glass within weeks, and World War III wouldn't have started with a missile. It would have started with a lie. It forces a question most history books won't ask. How many other Northwoods-style plans were drawn up and never leaked? How many operations didn't need fake flags because the real ones were waved loud enough? And how many Cold War secrets are still buried, not because they failed, but because they succeeded? Operation Northwoods isn't just a footnote. It's a window into a mindset, one where truth was optional, consent was inconvenient, and the ends always justified the means. So the next time you hear someone claim that governments wouldn't fake a crisis to start a war, remember, they didn't just think about it. They wrote it down. And speaking of bugs planted in all the wrong places, what if I told you the Soviets once handed the US a literal Trojan horse, one that sat in an embassy office, listening silently for 7 years? The mystery of the thing. Imagine you're the US ambassador to the Soviet Union. It's 1945. The war is over. The Cold War is still a whisper in Churchill's throat, and one day, a group of smiling Soviet school children show up at your embassy with a gift, a beautifully carved wooden plaque of the Great Seal of the United States. Adorable, wholesome, diplomatic gold, so you hang it on your office wall, right above your desk, and it stays there for 7 years. Then one day, someone discovers that the plaque is listening. This wasn't some cartoon bug with blinking red lights. It wasn't plugged into anything. It had no wires, no batteries, nothing that suggested it should function as a surveillance device. And yet it did. They called it the thing. It worked via a technique known as passive resonant cavity surveillance. Translation, it was a tiny device hidden inside the wooden plaque that could be activated remotely by a specific radio frequency. When hit with the right beam, the device would resonate and transmit audio. No power source, no signal unless pinged. Just dead wood and metal. Until it wasn't. Let's pause there. This was 1945. The transistor had barely been invented. Most Western engineers would have laughed if you told them a wireless, battery-free microphone was even possible. The Soviets didn't laugh. They built one, gifted it to their enemy, and listened in on diplomatic secrets for 7 years without being detected. That's Cold War flexing before the Cold War was even officially cold. The creator of this sci-fi grade device was Léon Theremin. Yes, the same guy who invented the eerie musical instrument of the same name. After falling into Stalin's orbit, Theremin was imprisoned, then repurposed for Soviet intelligence. Because in the USSR, if you had talent, they didn't care what you wanted to do with it. You would build what they needed, and so he did. The thing sat silently on the wall of the U.S. ambassador's office from 1945 to 1952. It overheard classified discussions, confidential phone calls, whispers of negotiations and frustrations. The Soviets only needed to drive by outside in a van, ping it with a radio beam, and boom, live feed from inside the U.S. diplomatic mission. When it was finally discovered by accident, during a routine check for bugs, American engineers were baffled. It took months to reverse engineer it. Even then, they couldn't believe the Soviets had pulled it off. No power, no moving parts, just clever physics and Cold War ambition. When the US tried to confront the Soviets about it, denials, smirks, the usual. Because admitting to it would mean acknowledging just how far ahead they'd been in certain arenas. And besides, it was just a gift from school children, remember? In 1960, the US finally went public, bringing the thing to the United Nations to embarrass the Soviets. They held it up during a session, waving it like a cursed artifact. Look what they gave us. Look what they did. But by then, the game had already changed. The technology had been adapted, refined. passed through intelligence agencies on both sides, like a relic of dark magic. To this day, the thing is considered one of the greatest feats of spycraft ever devised. It predated RFID chips. It anticipated contactless data transfer. It predicted the very principles behind modern passive surveillance, the kind embedded in your credit cards, your passports, your smart devices. And maybe that's the real punchline, because while the plaque is now sitting in a glass case at the NSA's National Cryptologic Museum, its DNA lives on, not in a dusty embassy office, but in your pockets, in your home assistant, in the tech that hears more than it should, says nothing, and requires you to trust it. The thing wasn't just a Cold War spy tool, it was a preview, a warning gift disguised as a gesture of goodwill. And in a way, it worked too well. Because once you realize the enemy can listen without leaving a trace, silence becomes a weapon. Which brings us to the next mystery, a tragedy in the sky, one that may have been a blunder or a kill shot. The KAL-007 Shootdown, September 1st, 1983. A Boeing 747, Korean Airlines Flight 007, drifts off course into restricted Soviet airspace. It's a routine commercial flight from New York to Seoul, with 269 people on board, including a U.S. congressman. It never makes it. Somewhere near Sakhalin Island, Soviet air defenses scramble jets. After a few tense minutes of radar tracking, one of the pilots, Major Gennady Osipovich, launches 2 air-to-air missiles. Flight 007 is blown out of the sky. Everyone dies. The world predictably erupts. The official Soviet response, they thought it was a U.S. spy plane, an RC-135, a provocation, a threat, a legitimate military target. The official U.S. response, outrage, denunciation. Reagan calls it a massacre. The Soviets are branded murderers. Tensions spike. It's one of the most dangerous Cold War moments not involving nuclear codes. And on the surface, that's the story. A civilian plane accidentally crossed a line and paid the price. But beneath the surface, where the Cold War always really lived, things don't quite line up. Let's start with the flight path. KAL-007 was supposed to follow a predetermined route. Instead, it deviated, not by a little, by hundreds of miles. It drifted into some of the most sensitive Soviet airspace on the planet, near military installations on Kamchatka and Sakhalin, areas that were, let's say, not big on trespassers. The official explanation, a computer navigation error. The plane's autopilot remained in heading hold mode rather than switching to the INS system that would have corrected its course. That's what the Korean Pilots Union claimed. But this was a long-haul intercontinental flight with professional pilots. These were not amateurs. How does a plane fly that far off course for hours and no one notices? And more importantly, how does the U.S., with its vast satellite network, radar stations, and listening posts, not notice that their allies' plane is drifting into Soviet crosshairs? Unless they did notice. Here's where it gets cold. There was a U.S. spy plane, a real one, flying in the area that night. A Boeing RC-135 designed to collect electronic intelligence. Some reports suggest the Soviets were tracking both planes and may have confused them. Or, depending on who you ask, the 2 planes deliberately flew similar paths to confuse Soviet radar, used the civilian aircraft as cover for intelligence gathering. In other words, bait. The US has always denied this, but Soviet intelligence suspected it, and if they were right, or even half right, then Flight 007 wasn't just in the wrong place. It was sacrificed. Then there's the question of the black boxes, the flight data and cockpit voice recorders. The Soviets recovered them quickly, but they didn't hand them over. Not in 1983, not for a decade. When the tapes were finally released in 1993, after the Soviet collapse, they told a haunting story. The crew had no idea they were off course. No alarms, no panic, just confusion and then silence. And yet, some things were missing. The final minutes, portions of the transcript, questions left dangling, theories exploded. Was it espionage gone wrong? A U.S. intelligence op that used the flight as cover? Or distraction? Some claimed the Soviets knew it was a civilian flight, but shot it down anyway as a message. Others say the U.S. let it happen to justify a strategic escalation. In 1996, a former Soviet radar officer claimed the real mission of Flight 007 was not passenger transport. He stopped short of calling it a spy plane, but the implication was clear. There was more to this flight than a wrong turn. And then, of course, there are the conspiracy corridors. Theories that some passengers survived the crash, that they were captured, interrogated, used as leverage in secret deals. No bodies were ever recovered, only scattered remains. The site was heavily controlled by Soviet forces. The remains of Congressman Larry McDonald, the only sitting U.S. official killed, were never found. Did the plane crash instantly? Or did it glide down? Was there a cover-up? Or just Cold War confusion dressed in its usual paranoia? What we do know is this: the tragedy of Flight 007 became a tool. The US used it to justify hardening its stance on Soviet aggression. The Soviets used it to justify more secrecy, more militarization. And the truth, whatever it was, became another casualty. In the Cold War, no death was meaningless. Every crash site was a chessboard, and sometimes the pieces were human. Speaking of which, what happens when you start hearing things through the walls, through your skull? The Cuban Acoustic Harassment Project. Before Havana Syndrome made headlines, before diplomats started hearing phantom buzzing and waking up with scrambled memories, the Cold War had already perfected the art of sound as weapon. It was just buried, like most things, under a pile of plausible deniability. Welcome to the shadowy world of acoustic harassment, where your own embassy becomes the battlefield and the weapons don't explode, they hum. The early reports started in Cuba, not in 2016, but decades earlier, back when Fidel's revolution had just slammed the door on Western influence, and the CIA was trying to claw its way back in through the keyhole. According to declassified documents and first-person accounts, U.S. diplomats stationed at the newly reopened embassy in Havana during the 1960s and 70s began to experience strange phenomena, piercing high-pitched noises in the middle of the night, nausea, vertigo, difficulty concentrating, migraines that wouldn't stop, a general sense of being watched and listened to. At first, it sounded like paranoia. This was, after all, the Cold War. Everyone was watching everyone else. But then the symptoms became too specific, too repeatable, and, crucially, too localized. Some embassy staff claimed that only certain rooms in the building were affected, that stepping into a specific office or hallway would trigger the symptoms instantly, and leaving would make them stop. The assumption naturally was surveillance, that the Cubans had wired the building so thoroughly it had become one massive ear. But audio bugs don't usually cause nosebleeds. So the theory evolved. Maybe it wasn't bugs. Maybe it was directed energy, microwave radiation, or ultrasound beamed into the building to disrupt cognition, scramble thoughts, make diplomats question their sanity, or slowly ruin it. It was never officially acknowledged, of course. The US didn't want to admit it had been caught flat-footed, and Cuba, well, they were too busy dancing on the edge of Soviet patronage to blink. But the rumors kept swirling. Not just in Havana, in embassies across Eastern Europe, in Moscow, in Berlin, even in Asia, American intelligence officers began filing quiet complaints. Headaches, memory lapses, ringing ears that wouldn't stop. The term microwave harassment started to circulate internally, usually accompanied by blank stares and nervous laughter. In 1976, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow experienced what came to be known as the Moscow signal, a focused microwave beam aimed at the building for decades. That's right, decades. It was only confirmed years after it started. No one really knew why it was being used. Was it to power covert listening devices, crowd control testing, or something far stranger? Here's where it gets more speculative and more sinister. Some CIA officials believed the Soviets were experimenting with psychotronic warfare, the idea that certain frequencies could alter behavior, influence mood, or even damage neural tissue. These weren't conspiracy blogs. These were memos, the kind written in cautious typewriter ink and buried behind black redactions. And the science? Murky, but not non-existent. Studies show that prolonged exposure to certain frequencies, especially infrasound and pulsed microwave radiation, can cause confusion, nausea, and even hallucinations. It's called the Frey effect, named after Alan H. Frey, the researcher who discovered that microwave signals could make people hear sounds that weren't there. Literal voices in your head, without a speaker in sight. Now put that in the hands of a Cold War Black Ops unit and sprinkle in a little paranoia, and suddenly that ringing in your ears isn't so innocent. Flash forward. In the 1980s and 90s, defense contractors and intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain were quietly exploring non-lethal weapons, devices that could disable, disorient, or mentally destabilize targets without leaving visible marks. In 1997, the US military even admitted it had developed a prototype active denial system, a weapon that used microwave bursts to create an unbearable burning sensation on the skin. It was real. It was tested, but it wasn't new. What if these so-called prototypes were just refinements of something much older, something tested, deployed, and then quietly folded into diplomatic folklore? That place where deniability thrives. Now fast forward again to the 21st century. American diplomats in Havana, yes, again, begin reporting the same symptoms their Cold War predecessors whispered about. Brain damage, memory loss, nausea, nightmares. Only now it has a name. Havana Syndrome. Only now we pretend to be surprised. So was it Cuba, Russia, a rogue intelligence faction, or just the ghost of Cold War tech nobody ever admitted existed? Because once you open the door to sonic weapons and psychotronic influence, you're not just rewriting battlefield doctrine. You're questioning the stability of reality itself. And if a weapon can pierce your mind without leaving a scar, how do you fight back? Which brings us to a man who might have known the answer and was found floating face down in the Chesapeake Bay. The disappearance of CIA agent John Paisley. The Chesapeake Bay is calm, even beautiful at times. It's not the place you'd expect to find the floating corpse of a senior CIA officer, but that's exactly where John Paisley turned up, or rather, what was left of him. September 24th, 1978. Paisley's sailboat, the Brillig, was found drifting silently under the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. The engine was running, the sails were down, the radio was silent. The captain? Missing. A few days later, Paisley's body surfaced. Shot in the head, weighted down with a diving belt, a single bullet through the skull, execution style, ruled a suicide. Let's pause for effect. He was a senior CIA analyst, fluent in Russian, with high-level clearance on Soviet military capabilities. He helped shape American nuclear policy, and his death was ruled a self-inflicted gunshot while floating in open water, with weight strapped to him and no weapon ever found. Sure, totally normal. The official version, Paisley was depressed, recently divorced, struggling emotionally. He took a gun, shot himself in the head while at sea, and, with incredible precision, managed to secure his body to the seabed before expiring. The problem is that John Paisley didn't fit the mold of a man unraveling. He was still working part-time for the CIA, still attending meetings, still connected to ongoing operations, and he'd just had eye surgery. Not the kind of thing you schedule when you're planning a dramatic, waterlogged exit. Then there's the crime scene, or lack thereof. No blood found on the boat, no sign of a struggle, no suicide note, and again, no gun. So, what really happened? One theory is that Paisley was a double agent, playing both sides of the Cold War. If he'd been turned by the Soviets, or if someone thought he had, that would have made him both invaluable and expendable, a chess piece no one could afford to leave on the board. Another theory, he knew too much about Soviet missile capabilities, about compromised CIA assets, about domestic surveillance programs, or maybe something even darker, something not meant to see daylight in the post-Watergate climate. His death came just a few years after the Church Committee had blown open the CIA's closet full of skeletons, MK Ultra, domestic spying, the family jewels. In that atmosphere, loose ends weren't just risky, they were radioactive. The CIA, of course, denied any connection to his death, said he was off duty, said they were sad, confused, and definitely not covering up anything. But former colleagues weren't convinced. Some insiders speculated that Paisley had been terminated, not by the Soviets, but by his own agency, as a warning, or to silence whatever piece of Cold War baggage he was still carrying. It wouldn't be the first time. Others believe Paisley may have faked his death, that the body wasn't his at all. After all, dental records were inconclusive. And what better way to vanish than by dying under suspicious circumstances? Some of his friends even received anonymous phone calls after his death. Heavy breathing, clicks, voices in Russian, harassment, or proof that someone wanted them scared into silence? In 1990, investigative journalist David Martin published a book, Wilderness of Mirrors, alleging that Paisley was part of an internal mole hunt, possibly linked to another Cold War enigma. The defector Anatoly Golitsyn, whose predictions of Soviet deception would haunt U.S. intelligence for decades. More on him in a minute. Back to Paisley. The real tragedy isn't just that he died, it's that we'll never know who ordered it or why. Because in the Cold War, truth wasn't buried. It was weighted down and dumped overboard, and Paisley's death served as a brutal reminder. Intelligence agencies don't fear death, they fear leaks. And the ocean, it turns out, makes a perfect filing cabinet. So maybe Paisley wasn't a traitor. Maybe he wasn't even murdered. Maybe he really did take his own life, haunted by secrets he couldn't carry anymore. But then again, when was the last time a depressed man staged a spy movie death scene in the middle of the bay without leaving a trace? Sometimes the cover story tells you everything by telling you nothing. And speaking of spies, secrets, and chilling predictions, what do you do when a defector shows up and starts making prophecies? Even worse, what if they start coming true? The Operation Ivy Bells mystery, when you think of Cold War espionage, you probably picture trench coats in foggy alleys, briefcases chained to wrists, or maybe a secret microdot hidden in a tube of lipstick. But some of the most sensitive spying didn't happen in Moscow or Washington. It happened at the bottom of the sea. This is Operation Ivy Bells, a top-secret U.S. Navy mission that sounds like the title of a Tom Clancy novel, and might be stranger than anything Clancy ever imagined. The premise was simple. The execution? Anything but. In the early 1970s, American intelligence agencies discovered that the Soviet Navy was transmitting top-level communications via undersea cables laid between bases along the Sea of Okhotsk, a stretch of frigid water considered so heavily fortified, so remote, that the Soviets didn't even bother encrypting the messages. Big mistake. Enter the U.S. Navy's most elite team of divers, engineers, and underwater saboteurs. Their task: infiltrate enemy waters, find the cable, and attach a listening device that could tap Soviet conversations without detection. They called it a pod. It was about the size of a small car and had to be delicately clamped around the cable without damaging it or disrupting its signal. It recorded everything: naval movements, missile protocols, political directives, and the daily chatter of Soviet officers who thought no one was listening. For years, Operation Ivy Bells ran like clockwork. Submarines like the USS Halibut and later the USS Parche would sneak past Soviet sonar, drop divers onto the ocean floor, and retrieve the pods every few months, swapping them out like old film reels full of secrets. The haul was pure Cold War gold. The CIA and NSA translated mountains of Soviet military data, often reading messages weeks before Moscow's intended recipients. One analyst reportedly described it as like having a seat at the Kremlin's war table. But like all good things in the Cold War, Ivy Bells didn't stay secret forever. In 1980, former NSA employee Ronald Pelton, drowning in debt and looking to sell something valuable, walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and told them everything: names, coordinates, procedures. The tap was compromised. When the U.S. tried to go back, the cable was gone. Not cut, gone, ripped from the seabed, as if it had never been there. That's where things get weird, because here's the thing: even before Pelton's betrayal, Navy divers had reported strange occurrences: equipment malfunctioning near the tap site, strange sonar echoes, objects on the seafloor that weren't supposed to be there, shapes that moved, signals that weren't Soviet or American. Some of the divers swore they heard low-frequency hums, ones that seemed to react to them. That followed them, dismissed as equipment noise, pressure hallucinations, imagination, maybe. But then there's the second tap theory. Some believe the US wasn't the only nation listening in, that another actor, unidentified, had found Ivy Bells first and placed their own device over it. A tap on a tap, watching the watchers. When the Americans finally retrieved one of the pods, they allegedly discovered it had been tampered with, not by Soviets, who had no idea Ivy Bells even existed, but by someone else. Carefully, quietly, no alarms, no sabotage, just accessed. Who? Nobody knows. Officially, there's no record. Unofficially, a few declassified memos refer to third-party anomalies in the cable records. That's Cold War code for, we found something we can't explain, and we're going to stop talking about it now. Even more disturbing, some reports suggest the Soviets began laying decoy cables, lines that went nowhere, transmission loops, traps, not to catch spies, but to see if anyone was watching the watchers. Paranoia turns recursive when you start wargaming your wiretaps. And maybe that's the core of the Ivy Bells mystery. Not the engineering, which was breathtaking. Not the intelligence, which was damning. But the sense that in trying to listen to everything, the US might have heard something it didn't understand, something that heard it back. Today, Ivy Bells is held up as a triumph of Cold War espionage. But the full scope, how long it went undetected, what was truly captured, and who else might have been listening, remains classified. Because once you start plumbing the depths of Cold War surveillance, you don't just find cables and secrets. You find echoes, and sometimes those echoes don't come from you. And if you think that's unsettling, wait until you hear what nearly triggered the end of the world because of a computer glitch. The 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm incident. It was just after midnight on September 26th, 1983. The world was asleep, but inside a bunker near Moscow, the early warning system wasn't. A red light flashed, then another, and another. According to Soviet satellites, 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles were inbound. Nuclear war had begun, except it hadn't. The man on duty that night was Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. His job was straightforward in theory and horrific in practice. If the computer said the US had launched missiles, he was to pass that information up the chain of command, quickly, decisively, triggering a counterstrike. No time for phone calls. No room for doubt. The doctrine was simple. Launch on warning. If you hesitate, your missiles might be destroyed on the ground. If you retaliate, you guarantee mutual annihilation. The logic of deterrence, executed by mid-level bureaucrats at 2 a.m. And on that night, the machine told Petrov the apocalypse had begun. The screen glowed with an unmistakable alert. Launch detected. 5 missiles, rising from US silos. Target, Moscow. His finger hovered over the phone. But something wasn't right. Petrov, trained to trust the system, didn't. 5 missiles? That seemed small. A first strike would involve hundreds, not a handful. It didn't match the strategy. It didn't feel right. And so, sitting in a concrete command center with klaxons wailing and sirens shrieking through the silence of space-based paranoia, Petrov made a decision. He did nothing. He waited. And as the countdown ticked toward impact, the alert stopped. It had been a false alarm. The culprit? A rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, misinterpreted by a Soviet satellite as the thermal signature of missile launches. No attack, no war, just a cosmic miscommunication, a bug in the sky. Had Petrov followed protocol, there's a very real chance you wouldn't be reading this right now. Moscow would have launched. Washington would have retaliated. Europe would have vaporized in the crossfire. Billions dead. Civilization paused indefinitely. All because of weather. Petrov was later praised, quietly. He wasn't awarded a medal. He wasn't promoted. In fact, he was reprimanded for not logging the incident properly. Because in the Cold War, saving the world wasn't heroic. It was embarrassing. Admitting the system failed, that your doomsday computer had a blind spot, was politically dangerous, especially when the entire Cold War was built on the illusion of total control. Petrov left the military shortly after, lived in obscurity, died in 2017, having once prevented global annihilation and been mostly ignored for it. It raises the obvious and terrifying question: how many times has this almost happened? And how many times did we not have a Stanislav Petrov on duty? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. False alarms weren't rare. The US and USSR both experienced dozens of near misses, flocks of geese mistaken for bombers, computer glitches, power outages. Each one came with the potential to end human history in under 10 minutes. The Cold War wasn't just tense, it was fragile. A Rube Goldberg machine of death, operated by men in uniforms, chained to machines that couldn't always tell sky from fire. And yet somehow we made it. But the system that nearly ended everything, it wasn't decommissioned, it was just upgraded. Russia's nuclear command and control infrastructure still includes semi-automated retaliation protocols. The infamous dead hand perimeter is allegedly dormant, but no one can say for sure. And the US, our early warning systems are faster, more precise, and just as prone to human error. So, what stopped the apocalypse in 1983? Not diplomacy, not strategy, not missiles or treaties. A gut feeling. One man, staring at a blinking screen, decided that silence felt truer than code. And if you're looking for something more chilling than global thermonuclear war nearly starting by accident, how about an even more elusive threat, one that everyone talked about, but no one could prove existed? The Red Mercury Hoax, or truth. It was small, it was red, and it could allegedly destroy the world. Or maybe it didn't exist at all. This is the maddening, looping Schrödinger's scandal of Red Mercury, a Cold War myth so persistent, so tantalizing, and so destabilizing that multiple governments chased it for decades without ever finding a single drop. Let's start with what it was supposed to be. Depending on the source, Red Mercury was a component for miniaturized thermonuclear bombs. Think suitcase nukes or even pocket nukes, a highly volatile compound that enabled pure fusion reactions. Fusion bombs that didn't need traditional fission triggers, a stealth explosive that left no radiation, no crater, just pure devastation. A high-density material for coating stealth aircraft, missiles, and radar-evading devices. A hoax created by Soviet intelligence to lure black market arms dealers into a sting operation. Yes, all of the above, and none. The first whispers of Red Mercury emerged in the 1970s and 80s, always from shadowy sources. Soviet defectors, Middle Eastern arms dealers, intelligence double talk. The substance was said to be manufactured only in the USSR under intense secrecy, using a complex process involving mercury, antimony, and some highly classified plasma technology. It was never officially listed as part of any nuclear development program, which of course made it more believable. In the black markets of the Cold War, Red Mercury became a holy grail, a portable apocalypse. Rumors spread that it could be used to trigger a nuclear chain reaction in small devices. No centrifuges, no reactors, just a vial of scarlet doom. Governments panicked. The KGB was said to be using rumors of Red Mercury to bait and track nuclear proliferation networks. Western intelligence feared that rogue states might acquire it, or worse, already had. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the floodgates opened. Conmen, opportunists, and legitimate intelligence agents all started offering Red Mercury for sale. At absurd prices. A kilo could fetch up to $300 million on the black market. And they weren't just selling vapor. Deals were made. Operations were run. In 1995, British intelligence arrested 2 men in London for attempting to buy Red Mercury. In South Africa, agents seized a supposed sample that turned out to be red-dyed mercury oxide. In the Middle East, reports surfaced of terrorists being duped into spending millions on jars of red paste, kitchen dye mixed with cinnamon and metallic flakes. But here's the twist. Even if it wasn't real, people acted like it was. And that made it real enough to terrify governments. In 2004, Sudanese rebels claimed to have acquired Red Mercury. Around the same time, Saudi Arabian police investigated a wave of hysteria where old sewing machines were being hoarded and sold for huge sums, based on the belief that their vintage components contained traces of the substance. In 2009, Egyptian authorities raided what they believed was a Red Mercury lab. It was a meth lab, or so they said. The US government officially calls Red Mercury a hoax, a legend, disinformation weaponized by the Soviets and seized upon by every arms dealer desperate for leverage. But here's the problem. The documents denying Red Mercury's existence often read more like damage control than certainty. And the physics? Strange as it sounds, there are theoretical methods by which high-density isotopes and mercury compounds might be involved in fusion reactions. Fringe? Yes. Impossible? Not exactly. What if Red Mercury wasn't a complete lie, but a failed experiment? A prototype gone nowhere? A black project with real components and a fake cover story? Or worse, what if it worked, and the only way to keep it from spreading was to bury it in absurdity? Because that's the genius of Cold War deception. Sometimes you hide a secret by making it sound like a joke, and that may be the true horror of Red Mercury. Not what it could do, but how far people were willing to believe in it, spend on it, kill for it, all for something no one could prove existed. In that sense, Red Mercury wasn't a substance. It was a mirror, held up to a world that had built entire arsenals on myth and suspicion. It tested how far people would go for an edge. And the answer, apparently, was all the way. So maybe Red Mercury never exploded, but it destabilized plenty just by being an idea. And speaking of missing pieces in Cold War space and time, how many astronauts didn't make it back? Not the ones we remember. The ones we never heard about at all. The lost cosmonauts theory. On April 12th, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit Earth. The Soviet Union basked in the triumph. America panicked. The space race was real, and Moscow had won the first round. That's the official story. But unofficially, there's another tale, far more unsettling. A tale of silence, of erased names, of radio transmissions picked up by amateur listeners, from voices that never returned. Welcome to the myth, or truth, of the lost cosmonauts. The theory goes like this. The Soviet Union, in its desperate push to beat the Americans into space, launched multiple manned missions before Gagarin. But something went wrong. Equipment failures, capsule malfunctions, re-entry disasters, and instead of broadcasting failure, the Soviets just erased it. They buried their dead in silence. Why admit a failed mission when you could simply pretend it never launched? Let's talk evidence. Not hard proof, perhaps, but an avalanche of eerie, persistent clues. Enter the Giudica Cordelia brothers, two amateur radio operators from Italy. In the early 1960s, they set up a makeshift listening station near Turin, complete with surplus military equipment and scavenged antennas. Their goal? Eavesdrop on Soviet space missions. And what they recorded is the stuff of nightmares. In May 1960, they picked up what sounded like a man breathing heavily, gasping for air, begging for help in Russian. Then, silence. In November 1960, they claimed to have intercepted a Morse code transmission from a Soviet capsule spiraling helplessly into deep space. A few months before Gagarin's flight, they allegedly recorded a woman's voice, calmly stating that she was burning up, that she was being pulled off course. Her final words were, "I am hot. I am hot." Then the feed went dead. The Soviets denied everything. Of course they did. But why were there so many anomalies in early Soviet launch logs? Why were missions retroactively renamed, renumbered, shuffled in and out of existence? Why did cosmonaut photos get airbrushed? Not just to remove people, but to unmake them? There's the case of Vladimir Ilyushin, a decorated Soviet test pilot. Some Western reports claimed he was launched into orbit days before Gagarin and crash-landed in China. The Soviets denied the mission ever happened. Ilyushin himself never spoke publicly. Some believe he was imprisoned or silenced. Others think he was a scapegoat for a botched launch, a cosmic ghost in a bureaucratic shell game. And then there's the photographic evidence, or lack of it. In the pre-Gagarin era, several cosmonaut trainees appeared in early Soviet publications, only to vanish from later ones. No obituaries, no explanations, just airbrushed absence, as if their very presence had become politically inconvenient. One name that keeps surfacing: Valentin Bondarenko, a promising cosmonaut trainee who died horribly in a pressure chamber fire in 1961, just days before Gagarin's flight. His death was covered up for decades, only admitted in 1986, long after the USSR had started rewriting its own secrets. So if Bondarenko was real and hidden, who else was? Some skeptics say the Giudica Cordelia recordings were faked. The brothers had no independent verification. Their tapes were dramatic, yes, but unverifiable. Could it have been audio hoaxes? Maybe. But why would two obscure Italian teens go to such lengths, fabricate such precise telemetry, and stick to their story for over 50 years? Even NASA, quietly, admitted that they couldn't explain everything the brothers picked up. Then there's the question of Soviet silence, not denial, silence. The kind that only comes when the truth is worse than the lie. Because the Cold War wasn't just about winning. It was about controlling the narrative. A dead cosmonaut would stain the myth of Soviet superiority. A failed space mission could shatter the illusion of inevitability, so they buried them in paperwork, in radiostatic, in sky. It's the idea that history was redacted not just in books, but in real time, that someone died looking down at Earth and was erased from it entirely. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of the lost cosmonaut story, not the technical failures, not the dying voices, but the idea that we never knew how many lives paid for the first steps into the stars. Because for every Gagarin, there might be 3 or 4 forgotten names, still orbiting, still burning, still calling for help through dead frequencies. And speaking of lost voices, what happens when the CIA sends ships to the bottom of the ocean to recover a Soviet submarine, and maybe doesn't tell us what else they brought back? Project Azorian and the Glomar Explorer. In 1974, the CIA tried to steal a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and they almost pulled it off. This is Project Azorian, an audacious, borderline insane Cold War operation where billions of dollars, cutting-edge technology, and one very large lie were deployed in pursuit of one of the rarest things on Earth, an intact Soviet nuclear submarine. The story begins in March 1968, when the K-129, a Soviet Golf II class sub, sank in the Pacific, about 1,600 miles northwest of Hawaii. Cause, unknown. Official Soviet search efforts were frantic and unsuccessful, but the US, thanks to a top-secret underwater listening network known as SOSUS, found it at a depth of over 16,000 feet. For context, that's 3 miles straight down, deeper than most mountains are tall. A place where pressure crushes steel, and human bodies implode before they can scream, but the CIA didn't blink. Why? Because the K-129 may have been carrying cryptographic gear, nuclear warheads, and, most importantly, the codes to the Soviet launch systems. If the US could retrieve it, they wouldn't just gain hardware. They'd gain insight into Soviet protocols, weaknesses, and first strike capabilities. So, naturally, they built a ship. A very special ship. Enter the Glomar Explorer, commissioned by billionaire Howard Hughes, or so the cover story claimed. On paper, it was built to mine manganese nodules from the ocean floor. In reality, it was a CIA-engineered deep-sea salvage vessel with a massive mechanical claw, the capture vehicle, designed to grab the sub from the seabed and lift it intact into a hidden moon pool inside the ship. This was Cold War absurdity at its finest. Stealth cranes, acoustic decoys, compartmentalized crews, and a fake ocean mining story backed by one of the most famously eccentric men in America. And it worked, almost. In the summer of 1974, the Glomar Explorer reached the wreckage. The claw descended. It grasped part of the submarine and began the slow, silent ascent. But halfway up, something broke. A mechanical failure caused 2/3 of the sub to slip through the claw's grip and plummet back to the ocean floor, unrecoverable. Only a small section was brought aboard. What was inside? That's the part that's never been made public. The CIA claims they retrieved a small portion of the forward section, with 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes and the remains of 6 Soviet sailors. A secret burial at sea was held, filmed, and eventually leaked. But as for codebooks, encryption tech, communications logs, classified. And it gets stranger. Some insiders suggest that the part of the sub they recovered contained a rogue mission log, that the K-129 may have been involved in a clandestine operation gone wrong. One theory claims it was a false flag nuclear launch, intended to fire a missile at the US and frame China. In other words, the sub wasn't lost. It was sabotaged. Another theory, the Soviets knew the US had found the wreck and let them recover it to feed them disinformation. And then there's the idea that they found something else. What exactly? No one knows. But the fact that parts of Project Azorian remain classified to this day, half a century later, suggests that what they found was more than twisted metal and waterlogged manuals. Maybe it was evidence of Soviet weapons we never knew existed. Maybe it was proof of internal sabotage, or an attempted defection, or maybe it wasn't Soviet at all. Some crew members reported anomalies during the mission. radiation spikes, strange cargo containers, odd behavior from the security detail. One engineer later hinted that what was brought up wasn't all man-made. Of course, that sounds like conspiracy bait, and maybe it is. But the CIA's response didn't help when journalists began filing FOIA requests for details. The agency issued its now famous line, "The CIA can neither confirm nor deny the existence of records responsive to your request." That phrase, it was born here. It's known as the Glomar response. So the next time a government tells you nothing and acts like that's a favor, you can thank a Soviet submarine, a deep-sea claw, and the Cold War's most expensive fishing expedition. And if you think that was eerie, wait until you hear what was happening to the animals around Cold War military sites. Not soldiers, not spies, not civilians, cattle. Mysterious animal deaths around military bases. They say the Cold War didn't draw blood on American soil, that it was fought in shadows, in mines, in boardrooms, and bunkers. But try telling that to the cows. Beginning in the late 1960s, and accelerating through the 70s and 80s, reports began surfacing across the United States, and in parts of Europe too, of animal mutilations so strange, so precise, that no predator could be blamed. The scenes were always the same. Cattle found dead in open fields, eyes removed, tongues excised, genitals surgically stripped, blood gone, entire carcasses drained red. No footprints, no tire marks, no sign of struggle, just silence and fear, and almost always within a few miles of a Cold War military installation. Coincidence? Maybe, at first, but then came the patterns. Near radar arrays in Montana, outside missile silos in New Mexico, around remote listening posts in Utah and Nebraska, ranchers would wake to find dead animals, sometimes multiple, with no obvious wounds, yet massive internal trauma, organs removed with surgical precision, bodies left behind almost reverently, or like a message. Law enforcement was baffled. The FBI opened a quiet investigation in 1975, not into animal cruelty, but into national security risks. Why? Because some of the reports came from people who weren't supposed to be afraid. Military police, Air Force personnel, engineers working on top-secret radar systems. These weren't farmers chasing shadows. These were professionals who had seen classified things and still found this unexplainable. Then the theories began. Satanic cults were blamed. Briefly, so were pranksters. Natural decomposition, even lightning strikes. But none of those explained the laser-like incisions, the absence of blood, the internal organs removed without breaking surrounding tissue. Some ranchers began reporting helicopters flying low at night, unmarked, silent, government style, black. But when asked, the military denied any aerial operations in the area. A few locals took to patrolling their land with rifles. Others just stopped reporting what they found. It was too strange to explain, and too regular to ignore. Then the whispers started that the mutilations were Cold War experiments, weapons testing, radiation monitoring, psychological warfare research, that the animals weren't being harmed by outsiders, but by insiders, government contractors, special projects, and that what they were testing wasn't meant for animals. Some theorized that cattle near radar stations were being used as biological indicators, canaries in the nuclear coal mine, that these animals were exposed to microwave radiation, then recovered and dissected to measure tissue damage. The fact that this mirrors some early MK Ultra era science only deepens the unease. Then came the even darker idea that the mutilations were practice, a grotesque dress rehearsal for battlefield biowarfare, surgical removal of organs, non-invasive extraction, precise targeting of biological systems. Some believed this was tied to Cold War doctrines about incapacitating, not killing, about leaving a population sick, bleeding, broken, but alive. There were even claims that some cattle showed signs of having been airlifted, operated on midair, and dropped from above. Bodies shattered internally, but skin untouched. Impact wounds from great heights. Again, no blood. And remember, this was decades before drones, before silent rotors, before the military even admitted to half of what it was capable of. In 1997, retired Air Force Colonel John B. Alexander, a man who spent years involved in unconventional warfare studies, called the mutilations the most bizarre and troubling mystery he encountered in his career. He claimed to have reviewed cases involving full autopsies and surveillance footage, and he confirmed something was happening, but even he couldn't say what. Then as the Cold War ended, the reports slowed, but they didn't stop. To this day, isolated clusters of mutilations still occur, almost always in the same regions, always with the same signs, and never with arrests. So maybe it wasn't the Soviets, or aliens, or teenagers in robes. Maybe it was the Cold War machine itself, testing limits, studying biological effects, practicing for a war that never came, but never fully ended. And if you think animal mutilation was disturbing, just wait until the US government voluntarily released radioactive gas over its own citizens. Yes, that happened. And no, it wasn't an accident. The 1949 Green Run radiation release. In December 1949, the US government conducted a secret experiment in the Pacific Northwest. No consent forms, no warning, no protective gear, just the deliberate release of radioactive gas into the atmosphere over populated areas. The test was called Green Run. And yes, it sounds like a sports drink or a 5K, but this wasn't about health. It was about war. Here's what we know. The Green Run took place at the Hanford site in Washington State, the same facility that had produced plutonium for the first nuclear bombs dropped on Japan. Hanford was ground zero for American nuclear ambition, and by 1949, it had become the US government's radioactive sandbox. On the night of the test, operators at Hanford intentionally reduced filtration protocols and allowed an unusually high release of radioactive iodine-131 and xenon-133, both dangerous isotopes. Why? To study fallout dispersion, how radioactive particles moved through the atmosphere, how they spread, how they traveled over terrain, and, chillingly, how they affected people. Roughly 8,000 curies of iodine-131 were released into the air. That's hundreds of times more than what you'd get from a standard nuclear reactor leak. It drifted eastward over towns, farms, schools, and no one had a clue. There were no warnings, no evacuations, no iodine tablets, just a quiet green cloud drifting over Washington and Oregon. The term Green Run refers to the use of uranium fuel that had not been allowed to cool sufficiently or cure after being removed from a nuclear reactor. This meant it was much more volatile and much more radioactive. This wasn't an accident. This was by design. The goal was twofold: to simulate Soviet plutonium production processes, which US intelligence believed used greener fuel, and thereby better track it via air sampling and spy planes, to study civilian fallout, quietly, in the real world, without asking anyone. It wasn't until the 1980s that details of the Green Run even surfaced, buried in now declassified DOE documents. The people living in the exposure zone only found out decades later, and by then, the damage had already been done. Increased rates of thyroid cancer, leukemia, miscarriages, and developmental disorders have all been reported in the region. Some locals began organizing, filing lawsuits, demanding studies. The government admitted almost nothing. Most of the documentation around Green Run remains partially redacted. Some pages are missing entirely. Others are filled with vague references to environmental sampling, biological uptake, and the kind of sterile language that makes slow poisoning sound like a focus group. One internal memo even described the release as a useful real-world modeling opportunity. Translation: let's see what happens when we gas a few thousand unsuspecting Americans. The Department of Energy eventually acknowledged that Hanford had released radiation on hundreds of occasions between the 1940s and 1960s. Green Run was just the most infamous, or at least the most traceable, but the Cold War calculus was simple. Fear of Soviet nuclear capabilities justified almost anything, and if a few thousand rural Americans had to play guinea pig, so be it. The irony is, the data from Green Run wasn't particularly useful. The weather didn't cooperate. The dispersion models were sloppy. The radioactive cloud didn't travel exactly as predicted. The damage was real. The insight? Not so much. So in the end, Green Run failed as a scientific experiment, but it succeeded as a moral stress test. And America failed, because it turns out you don't need a secret police or a gulag to terrorize your population. Sometimes all it takes is a quiet, invisible fog and a file marked top secret. And if you're wondering how far the US government was willing to go to monitor its own citizens during the Cold War, let's just say you didn't need to be irradiated to get their attention. You just needed to protest. Operation CHAOS. The Cold War was supposed to be fought overseas, in jungles, in deserts, in embassies, and back alleys. But by the late 1960s, the battlefield had come home, and the enemy was, inconveniently, the American people. Enter Operation Chaos, the CIA's domestic surveillance program so wildly unconstitutional that even J. Edgar Hoover raised an eyebrow. The name sounds theatrical. Chaos. You'd expect explosions, sabotage, maybe a rogue agent or two in a leather trench coat. But the real story is quieter and far more disturbing. The operation began in 1967 under President Lyndon B. Johnson. The mission: infiltrate, monitor, and collect intelligence on anti-war activists, civil rights leaders, journalists, and students. Essentially anyone who looked like they might not be on board with the U.S. military-industrial complex. On paper, this violated the CIA's own charter, which prohibited it from conducting operations on domestic soil. The FBI was supposed to handle that. But the logic of chaos went like this. If the anti-war movement was being influenced or funded by foreign actors, read the Soviets, then it became a national security issue. And if it's national security, then all bets are off. So the CIA set up an internal unit, gave it a nondescript name, the Office of Security, then staffed it with hundreds of analysts, agents, and paper pushers. Over the next 7 years, they compiled files on over 300,000 Americans. Let that number sink in. Students who protested the draft, women's rights groups, civil rights organizers, clergy who preached peace, even reporters who covered Vietnam too honestly. And yes, they spied on Vietnam veterans too. Just in case they came back with thoughts. They monitored mail, tapped phones, used informants to infiltrate campuses. Some files tracked people down to the color of their protest signs. What did they find? Nothing. Or more accurately, they found exactly what you'd expect. Americans being American. Loud, angry, occasionally dramatic, but overwhelmingly not Soviet agents. But once an intelligence agency starts watching its own citizens, it never just stops. Bureaucracies don't die of boredom. Operation Chaos fed into other programs, Merrimack, Resistance, and HT Lingual, each more invasive than the last. Together, they formed a patchwork of surveillance that blanketed the anti-war era like smog. Unseen, inhaled, and poisoning everything. Then came the leak. In 1974, Pulitzer-winning journalist Seymour Hersh published an expose in the New York Times revealing chaos and other CIA domestic operations. The backlash was volcanic. Congress launched the Church Committee hearings, which dragged CIA officers, FBI agents, and NSA officials into the daylight. There were testimonies, redacted documents, white-knuckle denials. The public learned that the CIA had not only spied on Americans, it had tried to discredit them. In one case, they considered forging documents to make a black activist look like a Soviet agent. In another, they discussed sending anonymous letters to break up marriages and incite paranoia. Operation Chaos wasn't about gathering intelligence. It was about controlling narrative. And yet, no one went to prison. There were no real penalties. Just a few strongly worded memos, a few reassignments, and some deeply uncomfortable headlines. The CIA promised it would never happen again. You'll be shocked to hear it did. In the years since, new programs have emerged with eerily similar playbooks. Names change, acronyms evolve, but the core remains. If you dissent too loudly, you're interesting. And here's the real kicker. The Soviets weren't behind the anti-war movement, but they didn't have to be. The fact that American intelligence thought they might be was enough to justify surveillance. The Cold War logic was flawless in its madness. Dissent equals danger. Danger equals espionage, and espionage must be neutralized, which means that by the 1970s, the line between Soviet methods and American ones had grown uncomfortably thin. And if you think spying on protesters is bad, just wait until an entire city looks up and sees something that isn't supposed to exist. Not a spy, not a plane, not a weather balloon, a flying jellyfish, and no one, not even the KGB, can explain what it was. The 1977 Petrozavodsk UFO Incident started at 4 a.m. on September 20th, 1977, in the quiet Soviet city of Petrozavodsk, nestled near the Finnish border. What happened next would rattle air defense systems, confuse astronomers, and leave behind a sky so strange it felt like fiction, except it wasn't. This was the Petrozavodsk phenomenon, or as it became known in hushed military circles, the jellyfish in the sky. Thousands witnessed it. They described a bright, pulsating object appearing in the pre-dawn sky over the city. It hovered. It glowed. It released what looked like shimmering tentacles of light, cascading down in every direction. People thought it was a nuclear missile at first. Some thought it was the second coming. Others froze in place, unable to explain the sheer unnaturalness of what they were seeing. It didn't behave like any known aircraft. It moved slowly, deliberately, then accelerated without sound, vanishing into the distance. This wasn't a single drunken farmer in a cornfield. We're talking about hundreds of trained observers, police officers, pilots, scientists, even journalists. In fact, the phenomenon was witnessed not just in Petrozavodsk, but across a vast portion of northwestern Russia and parts of Scandinavia. It was so widespread that the Soviet Ministry of Defense was forced to acknowledge it, which during the Cold War was like the Pope admitting he wasn't sure about God. Soviet air defenses scrambled. Radar installations lit up, yet nothing showed on screens. It was visible, but it wasn't trackable. A local newspaper ran a headline the next day, "A strange natural phenomenon over Karelia," except it didn't feel natural. Here's where it gets even stranger. Around the same time, the Soviet Union launched a satellite, Cosmos 955. Officially, it was part of a civilian scientific mission. Unofficially, it may have been a classified military payload. Coincidence? Maybe. But then the Soviet Academy of Sciences stepped in and claimed the glowing object was simply the exhaust plume from Cosmos 955, distorted by the atmosphere and sun's position. Right, a rocket plume that hovers, emits light tendrils, moves sideways, then disappears. Even for Cold War gaslighting, that was a stretch. Eyewitnesses pushed back. Astronomers published dissenting views. Some argued the visual patterns were consistent with electromagnetic interference, something that might result from experimental weapons or propulsion systems. Others pointed out that the phenomenon lasted far longer than a typical rocket burn, and the motion, it wasn't ballistic, it was controlled. Still, the party line held. Cosmos 955 was responsible. Mystery solved. Go home. Except they didn't solve it. They just stopped talking about it. In the years that followed, leaked military memos revealed that the Soviet government had launched a classified investigation. Air Force analysts collected witness statements. Physicists were consulted. Theories were explored, including holographic projection, directed plasma fields, and even psychotronic effects. One report, redacted but later uncovered, described the object as exhibiting behavior inconsistent with known aerodynamics and suggestive of intelligence-guided movement. Translation: it wasn't a satellite, it wasn't a cloud, and it wasn't theirs. To this day, no official explanation has accounted for all aspects of the Petrozavodsk sighting: the timing, the shape, the movement, the scale, the electromagnetic effects. In modern Russia, the event is still whispered about in aviation and military circles. A cautionary tale, a blip, a reminder that even in a world obsessed with control, some things still slip through the cracks. And the Cold War made those cracks wider. Because when your entire civilization is focused on deciphering your enemy's every move, the truly unexplainable gets filed under ignore immediately. Some believe it was a Soviet experiment gone wrong, a test of high-altitude lasers or weather control systems. Others think it was a U.S. spy platform, a black project, pushing into airspace it shouldn't have entered. And then there are the outliers, the ones who don't think it was ours, or theirs, at all. The kind who point out that the jellyfish-like structure matches descriptions from other mass sightings. In Belgium, in New Mexico, in the Arctic. The kind who suggest the Cold War wasn't just fought between two superpowers, but under the watchful eye of a third. Either way, Petrozavodsk remains one of the few mass sightings that forced a superpower to react, and then pretend it didn't, because the scariest light in the sky is the one no one wants to claim. And speaking of silent assassins, what if there was a gun designed by the CIA that could kill you without leaving a single mark? The CIA heart attack gun. In 1975, during a congressional hearing on CIA misconduct, a woman named Mary Embry took the stand and casually introduced the world to one of the most terrifying weapons ever conceived. Not a missile, not a drone, not a bomb. A gun that could induce a heart attack and leave no trace. That wasn't a metaphor. She meant it literally. And then, like something out of a Bond villain's inventory, a CIA representative held up the device. Small, pistol-like, clunky but simple. Inside a specially modified mechanism that could fire a tiny dart coated with shellfish toxin or another fast-acting poison. The dart would penetrate clothing, enter the bloodstream, dissolve, and kill the target within minutes. Cause of death? Cardiac arrest. Visible wound? None. The hearing room went cold. This wasn't conspiracy. This wasn't theory. This was testimony under oath, on the congressional record. There were diagrams, photographs, even a live demonstration of the mechanism, minus the toxin. No one in the room laughed. They called it a non-discernible, incapacitating device. It didn't even have an official name. That's how you know it's real. The toxin used could be any number of substances, but the most reported one was derived from shellfish venom, lethal in microgram doses, virtually undetectable in an autopsy. No convulsions, no swelling, just a calm, quiet death. Why build it? Because the CIA during the Cold War wasn't just collecting information. It was in the business of removing obstacles, sometimes foreign, sometimes domestic, and bullets were messy. Poison pills unreliable, plane crashes complicated, but a gun that mimics a natural heart attack? That's deniability incarnate. You could kill a foreign diplomat, a double agent, a journalist, even a political figure, and chalk it up to stress, genetics, or bad clams. You could erase someone so neatly that their own doctor would sign the death certificate with a shrug. The implications are horrifying, but also brilliantly Cold War. Because in a war without borders, where every death had political consequences, the best assassination was one that never raised suspicion at all. And this gun, it was the ghost of assassination tools. It didn't just remove people, it removed evidence. To this day, the CIA refuses to comment on how often it was used, or on whom. Was it deployed in Latin America against Cuban operatives, Eastern European defectors, domestic liabilities? We don't know, and that's the point. The US government has since tried to downplay the weapon's existence, claiming it was experimental, decommissioned, ineffective, but they said the same thing about MK Ultra, and we both know how that turned out. Here's the deeper horror. Heart attacks are common, especially in high-stress professions like diplomacy and espionage, especially among people who suddenly become inconvenient to a particular administration or agenda. How many Cold War deaths, shrugged off as natural, weren't? Was it used to silence someone, close off a leak, prevent a defection, or send a message? We'll never know, because the heart attack gun wasn't designed to kill loudly. It was designed to make death look boring. And the moment it became public knowledge, every natural death within intelligence circles gained a new footnote. What if one device, introduced in a single congressional hearing, reframed an entire era? And it's still out there. Maybe not the gun itself, but the philosophy behind it. The belief that if you can make death invisible, it stops being a crime. It becomes policy. And speaking of weapons we try to erase from history, what if I told you a US B-52 bomber crashed carrying 4 hydrogen bombs, and one of them was never recovered? Not in Russia, not in Cuba, in Greenland. The 1968 Thule Air Base crash. On January 21st, 1968, a US B-52 bomber crashed into the frozen sea ice near Thule Air Base in Greenland. It was carrying 4 thermonuclear bombs. Only 3 were recovered. Let that settle. The bomber was on a secret Chrome Dome patrol, part of a Cold War program in which fully armed bombers flew 24/7, orbiting strategic regions of the globe ready to retaliate at a moment's notice. Translation: we had nuclear bombs in the sky all the time, just waiting for someone to blink wrong. But that day, over the Arctic Circle, something went very wrong. The crew detected a fire in the cabin. The plane lost power. They bailed out. 6 men parachuted to safety. 1 died. The plane kept flying for a bit, then nosedived into the sea ice just a few miles from the Thule base. A key U.S. radar and early warning installation monitoring Soviet missile activity. The crash ignited a fire so hot it vaporized the ice. The conventional explosives in the nuclear bombs detonated, a non-nuclear explosion, scattering plutonium, uranium, and tritium across the Arctic landscape. The cleanup effort was immediate, classified, and deeply messy. The Pentagon launched Operation Crested Ice, scrambling military and scientific personnel to recover what they could: bomb fragments, debris, snow samples, melted equipment. 3 of the bombs were accounted for, at least in shattered pieces. The 4th, still missing. The official U.S. position is that all bombs were destroyed in the crash, but internal reports, including documents later declassified, clearly reference missing components. Some refer to a primary, the plutonium core, as unaccounted for. Others allude to large bomb fragments sinking through the ice into the freezing waters of North Star Bay, never recovered. And here's where things go fully Cold War Kafka. In 2008, the BBC unearthed a Danish government memo stating that one of the weapons was not recovered. This was especially problematic because Greenland is owned by Denmark, a country that had expressly banned nuclear weapons from its territory, a ban the U.S. quietly violated under the radar of plausible deniability. So not only was a nuke lost, but it was lost in a place where it wasn't supposed to exist in the first place. The U.S. government predictably refused to comment further. Denmark issued statements of concern, followed by silence, and local Inuit populations, some of whom were exposed to radiation during the cleanup, were largely ignored. Meanwhile, to this day, no independent survey has been allowed to dive beneath the ice and verify if anything remains. The area is still off limits, still patrolled, still quiet. Some speculate that the U.S. already retrieved the 4th bomb, but said nothing to avoid scandal. Others believe it was simply lost to the ocean, forever unreachable. But the darkest theory? That the bomb was intact and too sensitive to allow anyone, even allies, to get near it. Because this wasn't just a big piece of metal. This was a full-scale thermonuclear device, capable of flattening cities. Leaving it behind meant creating a long-term geopolitical hazard in one of the most sensitive military regions on Earth. And then there's the environmental toll. Decades after the crash, traces of radioactive materials were still being found in snowbanks, meltwater, even animal tissue. A toxic fingerprint sealed beneath the ice until the ice started melting. Climate change has begun exposing old Cold War sins. And the Arctic? It's thawing fast. What's buried may not stay buried for long, which raises an eerie question. What happens when the sea gives it back? What happens when a half-century-old nuke, dormant and forgotten, returns to a world that barely remembers it? The Cold War never ended. It just froze, literally. And speaking of secrets buried in desolate places, there's an island out in the Aral Sea, once uninhabited, now avoided by every living thing. The Soviets used it for tests, biological tests, and what they left behind may still be contagious. Secret Soviet bioweapon testing sites. In the middle of the Aral Sea, there's an island that used to appear on no maps. Vozrojdeniya Island, which means Resurrection Island. You'd be forgiven for thinking it sounds poetic, or ironic, or biblical. You'd also be right, because what the Soviets built there wasn't resurrection. It was apocalypse in Petri dishes. From the 1940s through the late 1980s, Vozrojdeniya Island served as one of the Soviet Union's most secretive and dangerous bioweapons testing facilities. Officially, it was a research station. Unofficially, it was a biolaboratory for weaponized pathogens: anthrax, smallpox, tularemia, plague, and other bugs that sound like the ingredients list for the end of civilization. The program had a name: Biopreparat, a sprawling clandestine Soviet initiative designed to match and exceed any Western biological warfare capabilities. The US had stockpiles of nerve gas and yellow cake. The Soviets had aerosolized anthrax and freeze-dried smallpox, tested in open air. And where better to run those tests than a remote island, surrounded by toxic water in the middle of a dying sea? Vozrozhdeniya was perfect, isolated, harsh, and controllable. Cages of animals, rabbits, monkeys, sheep were lined up and exposed to bioweapon dispersal. Wind direction was noted, kill times recorded, survivability charts were made, field tests, not simulations. According to defectors like Ken Alibek, a former high-ranking biopreparat official who fled to the US, some tests even involved live human subjects, prisoners, political dissidents, nobody who be missed, no records kept, just variables in a state-sponsored death lab. It was for decades a place so secret that even most Soviets didn't know it existed. But here's the punchline. Nature did. See, the Aral Sea didn't stay static. Thanks to massive irrigation projects under the Soviet regime, it began shrinking rapidly. By the 1990s, Vozrozhdeniya Island wasn't an island anymore. It was a peninsula, accessible by foot. Think about that. A former bioweapons test site full of mass graves containing live spores of anthrax, now walkable. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the site was abandoned. No cleanup, no security perimeter, just forgotten bunkers, rusting drums, broken vials, and a landscape poisoned by design. It wasn't until 2002 that the US, quietly and urgently, dispatched a team to assess the damage. They found open burial pits, leaking containers, and high concentrations of viable anthrax spores in the soil. The cleanup effort began, but even now, there's no certainty it was thorough or finished. Because some bacteria don't care about treaties. Spores like Bacillus anthracis, the kind used in Soviet weapons tests, can survive in soil for decades, possibly centuries. All they need is a host, a trigger, a mistake. And now that climate change has accelerated desertification in the region, wind-blown dust from the site is spreading farther than ever. The locals? Many suffer from chronic illnesses, immune disorders, strange symptoms no one can conclusively explain. They're told not to dig too deep, literally, and they're definitely not told the full history. Because the Cold War was never just a standoff of missiles and ideology. It was a science experiment gone rogue, and Vozrozhdeniya was the lab where that experiment ran wild. Some analysts believe not all of the biopreparat research was destroyed, that strains were transferred, that the genetic engineering done on the island, bacteria enhanced for resistance to antibiotics, or modified for delayed symptoms, were too valuable to simply bury. Others worry that the site may have been looted in the post-Soviet chaos, that some of those pathogens may have made their way into the hands of rogue states, or worse, black market networks. And then there's the silence. To this day, Russia has never fully acknowledged the scale of its bioweapons program. The documents are sealed, the records fragmented, the history still radioactive, metaphorically, and in some cases, not. What happened on Vozrozhdeniya Island was not a myth. It was a test on life, on death, on control. And the test never really ended. The wind just changed. And speaking of invisible weapons, the next mystery isn't about bacteria or bombs. It's about the mind. US psychic spy programs, forget satellites, forget bugs in hotel rooms and secret submarine cables. In the 1970s, the US government decided to try something different. They tried psychics. Not in a joke, not in a comic book, in real black budget operations, with funding, with titles, with mission reports typed in government font and filed into very real filing cabinets under remote viewing. Welcome to the realm of Project Stargate, the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency's boldest, weirdest, and most sincerely funded attempt to turn human minds into weapons. The idea that certain individuals could see things from great distances, not with their eyes, but with their consciousness, through walls, across oceans, into Soviet missile silos, nuclear bunkers, even the moon, if you believe the transcripts. They called it remote viewing, and they took it very seriously. The program began in the early 1970s at Stanford Research Institute SRI, where physicists Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ were tasked with testing whether psychic phenomena, specifically non-local perception, had any real intelligence-gathering potential. To their surprise, or maybe not, subjects began producing results. They'd sit in a room, close their eyes, enter a kind of trance, sketch what they saw: Soviet weapons facilities, hidden aircraft hangars, underground labs. One of the most famous psychics involved was Ingo Swann, a New York artist turned mental astronaut. Swann claimed to remote view Jupiter before the Voyager probe got there, accurately describing features like its ring system, which were later confirmed. Another viewer, Joe McMoneagle, worked for Army intelligence. He claimed to locate hostages, downed aircraft, and Soviet submarines, all from a padded chair in Fort Meade. He even once described what looked like a large submarine being built in a dry dock in a specific region of Siberia. Satellite imagery months later showed a large submarine being built in a dry dock in that exact location. Coincidence? Lucky guess. Pattern recognition. The CIA didn't care. They wanted more. They created a formal program known as Gondola Wish, then Grill Flame, then Center Lane, and eventually Stargate, because changing the name every few years makes the weird parts sound more bureaucratic. By the 1980s, millions of dollars had been spent on psychic warfare, not to destroy, but to observe, see without being seen. Congress was briefed, generals were intrigued, and yes, the Soviets were doing it too. In fact, they were probably doing it first. According to defectors, the USSR had invested heavily in parapsychology as far back as the 1960s, exploring not just remote viewing, but telekinesis, bioenergetics, even attempts at psychic assassination. Naturally, the US had to keep up. Could a skilled viewer peek into a Kremlin war room? Could they see inside a locked vault? Could they map the location of a mobile nuclear launch platform before it launched? Officially, yes, sometimes. The results weren't always consistent. Some sessions produced nonsense, waves of color, abstract shapes, pure imagination. Others were shockingly accurate, but the deeper the government dug into the mind, the more the mind pushed back. Viewers began reporting disturbing side effects: disassociation, nightmares, paranoia, intense fatigue. Some became convinced they were being psychically watched in return. A few even believed they were interacting with non-human intelligences during remote sessions. That's the part the reports don't like to mention, because once you start treating consciousness like a tool, it becomes harder to define what's inside and what's outside. By the early 1990s, the CIA had had enough, or at least said they had. They shut down Project Stargate publicly, citing inconsistent results, lack of operational value, skepticism from higher-ups. In 1995, a formal report concluded that remote viewing had not been proven useful in intelligence operations. But here's the part they leave out. While Project Stargate was shut down, many of its contractors remained active. Some transitioned into private intelligence firms. Others claimed the techniques were absorbed into more classified projects, buried deeper, renamed again. And the modern intelligence community, they've gone suspiciously quiet on the topic. Ask around in certain defense circles, and you'll hear murmurs that psychic surveillance was never truly abandoned, that anomalous cognition is still monitored, that somewhere, someone is still using their mind like a drone. And if you're laughing, good. That's what they want. Because the best Cold War weapons weren't just invisible. They were implausible. The kind of thing no rational enemy would waste time guarding against. And the mind, with its chaos and mystery, was the perfect hiding place. So the next time you get a weird thought, or feel like you're being watched for no reason, maybe you're not paranoid. Maybe you're just being perceived. And speaking of things that aren't supposed to exist, let's talk about a man who died, officially, then disappeared, unofficially, and to this day may still be out there. The secret nuclear accidents that never made the news. The Cold War nuclear arms race was loud, public, terrifying. But it also had a quiet side, one of unreported detonations, near misses, containment breaches, and accidents so dangerous that governments didn't dare admit they happened. Because losing a warhead is one thing, but losing the illusion of control, that's unacceptable. The official count of broken arrows, U.S. military term for lost, stolen, or accidentally detonated nuclear weapons, is 32. That's the official number. But dig into the declassified archives, the offhand testimonies, the redacted reports accidentally released, and the picture gets messier, more radioactive, more real. Let's talk about the Palomares incident in 1966. A B-52 collided mid-air with a tanker during refueling off the coast of Spain. 4 hydrogen bombs were dropped. 3 were recovered in farmland, busted open, scattering plutonium dust over Spanish villages. The 4th sank into the Mediterranean. Took nearly 3 months to locate and retrieve. The cleanup was frantic. Spanish fishermen were paid off. Farmland was stripped, topsoil buried in barrels, shipped back to the U.S. under the radar. Even now, parts of Palomares remain off limits due to lingering contamination. The U.S. promised to clean it up. That promise is still pending. 58 years later. Now multiply that scenario by dozens. In South Carolina, 1958, a bomb fell out of a B-47 during routine flight and exploded in a family's backyard. Thankfully, the nuclear core hadn't been inserted, but the conventional explosives detonated. House gone. Crater massive. Family miraculously alive. Government response: training accident. They were paid a small settlement, then told to stop asking questions. Or take Damascus, Arkansas, 1980. A dropped wrench, yes, a wrench, caused a fuel leak in a Titan II missile silo. The resulting explosion launched a 9-megaton nuclear warhead through the silo doors. It landed several hundred feet away and didn't go off because someone upstairs was feeling generous that day. The incident was almost entirely buried at the time. The missile technician who dropped the tool died. His family wasn't given a full account until years later. The public was told the situation was contained. It wasn't. And then there's the Soviet side, far murkier. While the US at least pretended to log its mistakes, the Soviet Union kept its nuclear mishaps locked in vaults guarded by denial and cement. But we know about Kishtim, 1957, the third worst nuclear disaster in history, behind Fukushima and Chernobyl. A waste storage tank at a plutonium production facility overheated and exploded. Thousands were exposed. An entire region, the East Urals radioactive trace, became a dead zone. It wasn't even acknowledged by the Soviet government until the 1980s. For years, locals thought they were just sick. Doctors were told not to record radiation exposure as a cause. Some were told to classify it as vegetative dystonia. Translation: radiation poisoning with plausible deniability. Even more disturbing, some accidents may have been tests in disguise. Rumors persist that both the US and USSR intentionally detonated dirty warheads in isolated regions to study contamination, spread, social panic response, and environmental consequences. Some believe the infamous Tunguska event in 1908, predating the Cold War, inspired Soviet attempts to recreate atmospheric detonations in Siberia using advanced weapon prototypes. A few Western analysts point to strange seismic data from the 1970s that doesn't match normal tectonic activity. Even today, when unexplained radiation spikes are detected in Europe or Asia, no one rushes to explain them. In 2017, radiation detectors in Europe picked up traces of ruthenium-106, a radioactive isotope used in nuclear reprocessing. The source was never officially identified, but all eyes turned to Russia. Russia looked back and said nothing. In Cold War geopolitics, silence is an answer. And then there's the question of what happened to all those unrecovered bombs. Tybee Island, Greenland, the Mediterranean, northern Canada. The list goes on. The official line? They pose no threat. Until they do, because nuclear material doesn't die. It just waits. And if Cold War history teaches us anything, it's that the most dangerous part of a weapon isn't its yield, it's the story attached to it. And sometimes the most powerful story is no story at all. Which leads us to the final mystery. Not a murder, not a crash, not a vanishing, but a question, one we've been circling for 2 hours. Here we are, the final mystery, the Cold War itself, a mystery of intent, illusion, and who really won. Here's the final mystery. Not a body, not a wreck, not a missing nuke or a psychic dream journal buried in a CIA desk drawer. It's the Cold War itself. the biggest psychological operation in human history, and the one mystery we still don't know how to solve. What was it really about? Was it freedom versus tyranny? Capitalism versus communism? East versus West? Or was it something much simpler and much stranger? Two superpowers locked in a staring contest so long that no one remembered why it started, and when it ended, no one could prove it. Think about it. The Cold War was a war with no battlefields, no peace treaty, no final declaration, just a fading whimper in the early 90s, as if someone quietly pulled the plug on the simulation. But simulations don't die. They reset. For 40 years, the world lived under the illusion of structure. Mutually assured destruction, red telephones, proxy wars, spy satellites, ideological trench warfare with better suits. But behind the scenes, backroom deals, double agents, assassination attempts written in typewriter font, secret budgets passed under the table, a global theater where the audience never saw the full script. Here's the real kicker. Everything we were told to believe about the Cold War might have been a distraction. While the world obsessed over missiles and maps, entire shadow architectures were being built. Global surveillance networks, information warfare, psychological control systems, behavioral manipulation via media, marketing, and soft propaganda. The Cold War gave both sides the excuse they needed to expand their reach into everything. Economies, science, education, space, medicine, even memory. And if you think that stopped in 1991, you haven't been paying attention, because the Cold War didn't die. It mutated into cyber warfare, data blackmail, AI weaponization, economic sabotage, nationalism disguised as nostalgia, globalism disguised as inevitability, new enemies with old playbooks. And the line between us and them, between truth and narrative, between state and self, gone. Now we live in what the Cold War dreamed of, a world where surveillance is voluntary, propaganda is personalized, and alliances are algorithmic. You carry the Cold War in your pocket, you stream it, you scroll it, you like and subscribe to it. The ghosts of the Cold War are not in documents. They're in you. So who won? Was it America, with its fast food, blue jeans, and Netflix? Was it Russia, still operating from a legacy of disinformation and post-collapse leverage? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone who saw the Cold War not as a threat, but as an opportunity to consolidate control, to expand intelligence infrastructure, to normalize secrecy, to make the surreal feel safe. Because here's the thing about war. When it ends, people expect peace. But when the war is cold and slow and silent, they forget to expect anything at all. They accept it. They adapt. They stop asking questions. And that might be the most successful psychological operation of all time. Maybe the Cold War was never about winning. Maybe it was about building a system that could keep running, with new villains, new acronyms, new crisis cycles, all fed through the same machine, all profitable, all quiet. Because mystery, when managed correctly, is more powerful than truth, and when the truth is too big to see, mystery becomes the only thing that feels real.